Hi everyone, welcome to Pax Christi USA's webinar, Environmental Justice Everywhere. My name is Rachel Schmidt. I'm the Communications Coordinator for Pax Christi USA, and I want to welcome you all here today. And I'd like to start off by introducing our presenter, Kerene Tayloe. I'm going to read a little bit about her. Kerene N. Tayloe, she works for We Act. She's a social justice advocate who has worked tirelessly in the areas of environmental justice, civil rights, and voter protection. She's the Director of Federal Legislative Affairs for We Act for Environmental Justice, a 31-year-old environmental justice organization founded in Harlem, New York, to ensure that communities of color engage in the creation and implementation of sound and fair environmental health and protection policies and practices. She is focused on ensuring that communities of color lead and speak for themselves as they address the important challenge of climate change. To that end, she believes it is imperative that people of color and women have access to economic opportunities in the renewable energy sector. As Kerene grows in her influence in the fight for our climate, she has shared her insight and experience as a speaker at various events, including Afropunk, Broccoli City Fest, the Clean Energy Leadership Institute, and the Congressional Black Caucus Annual Legislative Conference, just to name a few. She has been quoted as an expert on environmental issues in Essence magazine and other notable publications. In 2019, she was acknowledged as one of Grist magazine's 50 Fixers, an exclusive list of 50 leaders who are considered game changers in the environmental, energy, and sustainable sector. Kerene was chosen out of a pool of over 1,200 applicants. She has been featured on WUSA Giving Tips for Earth Day and has been featured on a number of popular podcasts sharing her views on how to advance the needs of communities of color and politics in our country. In addition to her environmental work, Kerene has worked in many political arenas, but is most proud of helping to elect New York State Senator Andrea Stewart-Cousins, the first African-American to represent the city of Yonkers in the state Senate, and the first woman in New York State history to lead a conference in Albany, New York. She is a proud alum of Fisk University and received her law degree at Florida A&M University College of Law. She is a strong advocate of historically Black colleges and universities and hopes to combine her advocacy work and support of historical Black colleges and universities to create career pathways to increase minority representation in the environmental and renewable energy fields. Kerene is a member of many organizations and associations, including the world's largest and most influential sorority founded for Black women, Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. So let's extend a big welcome to Kerene. Just a couple logistics. You can see on the right-hand side there is a chat, and you can ask your questions in the chat over the course of the webinar, and we will get to your questions at the end. And we're going to start off by sharing a video from We Act. So I'm going to get that playing.
The mantra of the environmental justice movement is that we speak for ourselves.
Environmental justice is something that everybody is entitled to. It's a right.
It's a constant movement for healthiness, for a clean environment, for people living longer and happier.
Certain communities are targeted for pollution and do not receive environmental benefits. Those communities are generally communities of color and low income around this country. So environmental justice is the fair and equal treatment of all people in all communities. The environment is in our neighborhoods where we live, work, play, and go to school. For the past 28 years, We Act has worked with community residents to engage in environmental decision-making that affects their community.
The bus depot has been here since like 1930s. We had buses that were, hanging around and just idling.
Diesel is a known carcinogen. It exacerbates asthma, heart disease.
And I want to live to a ripe old age.
The bus depots in northern Manhattan was a prime example of environmental racism, that these communities were targeted.
The task force came together for one purpose, and that was to make sure that if they were going to build another bus depot in this neighborhood, it was going to be done right, or we weren't going to let it happen at all.
Everybody got on board, and we pushed the MTA to do all these good things for us.
We were able to get the MTA to invest in compressed natural gas buses and then in hybrid buses.
When they idle the actual buses inside, it goes into a particular piece of equipment. It just purifies it a little bit.
Yeah.
If it wasn't for WEAC, we wouldn't have known all of this.
Now every city bus is cleaned up. Every community resident in this city is benefiting.
We control what happens to our community,
There you go.
and that's the best part about it.
We are very involved in indoor air quality, and so that takes us into the homes of many neighborhood residents in New York City Housing Authority buildings, what we call public housing.
We moved to the apartment from hell. Brown and green spots all over the ceiling and going down the walls in the bathroom. That's dangerous for your health.
The New York City Housing Authority spends a lot of time patching up problems, but not correcting the problems. You can't simply paint over mold. You really have to go to the cause of the moisture.
This became something that was normal to us. My younger daughter, she said, all I've ever known is a moldy bathroom. They said, there's no way you should continue living like this. They put us in touch with NYCHA. NYCHA, they knocked out each wall. They remediated the mold. The mold is not totally eradicated, but it's near there. WEAC helped me achieve a healthier home. They advocated for me. They were our voice.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. We're going up to Albany to fight for justice.
So to really make a change in people's lives, we really have to change policy and practice. And so we've been organizing our members to go to Albany to educate our elected officials.
I have lived in Harlem almost my whole life. I'm learning more in WEAC than I thought I came in with, believe me.
Hoy vengo más que todo para dejarle un futuro mejor a mi sobrino y a los niños después de él, y lo traigo para que él aprenda también.
If we fight against global warming, it's going to help all the countries around the world.
We need to take action now before he gets too late.
So as we look ahead, creating climate resilience throughout vulnerable communities is our real challenge. Whether it's storm surge, sea level rise, extreme heat events, and we are working to ensure that our communities are ready to meet that challenge. And so we've developed a number of community planning sessions with over 400 community residents and our members to hear what those challenges are and how they think those challenges need to be addressed. And we've now developed a series of policies to have real climate resilience. The environment is not about simply saving trees and polar bears, while that is extremely important, that we save all of our ecosystems. But we also have to realize that there is a human ecosystem as well, and that we must live together in harmony.
1, 2, 3.
Environmental justice!
Well, hi everybody. As Rachel stated, my name's Kerene Tayloe. I'm the Director of Federal Legislative Affairs for WEAC. Really excited to share with you all today, especially since yesterday was World Environmental Day, just to share with you some information and history about the environmental justice movement and how people of color and low-income communities are being impacted by climate change and environmental issues every single day here nationally and just also internationally. So I'm going to turn the camera off of me, but let's focus on the slide. So just thank you in advance for paying attention, and I look forward to any questions that you all might have towards the end. Thank you. So We Act is a 31-year-old environmental justice organization, and we're based and founded in Harlem, New York. We Act is one of the first environmental organizations in New York State to be run by people of color, and the first environmental justice organization in New York City. We Act for Environmental Justice was founded and incorporated in 1988 as the result of local community struggles around environmental threats and resulting health disparities created by institutional racism and the lack of social and political capital, all dynamics that led to the siting and poor management of the New York River sewage treatment plant, the siting of an operation of 6 out of 7 New York City diesel bus depots in northern Manhattan, and the operation in our communities of the only 24-hour marine transfer station in Manhattan, the use of northern Manhattan communities as New York City's dumping ground, and the exclusion of communities of color from democratic decision-making. Great. So these are just some of the focus areas that we do work. We're committed to the principles of environmental justice, and we are active and a respected participant in the national environmental justice movement. And we make it our goal to inform and educate and train and mobilize the predominantly African American and Latino residents of northern Manhattan on issues that impact their quality of life, air, water, indoor pollutions, toxins, land use, open space, etc. So we have a lot of work that we do not only in northern Manhattan, but also nationally. I work in our federal policy office, where I get to engage with members of Congress, the EPA, and other stakeholders around advocating for environmental justice nationally. Next slide. So it's always important before going into data and facts to ground ourselves in the principles of our movement and to just give some clear definitions. So what is environmental justice? Environmental justice is a social justice grassroots movement that seeks to protect communities of color and low-income communities from being overburdened with pollution. Citizens of different races and classes experience disparate environmental quality, directly affecting their public health and quality of life. The movement uses policy advocacy, research, community capacity building, and organizing to advance environmental justice. Next slide. So people of faith have been an important component and part of the environmental justice movement. One, and there are many early events or activities that we look to that have defined the movement, but one that people do focus on is that in 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King was actually participating with the Memphis sanitation workers there to help them advocate for better working conditions. And one thing he said that really resonates with me is, God sent us here to say to you that you're not treating his children right. And we've come by here to ask you to make the first item on your agenda fair treatment where God's children are concerned. Now, if you're not prepared to do that, we do have an agenda that you must follow. And our agenda calls for withdrawing economic support from you. And so there's always been, even for me and how I've approached my work, just a strong desire to connect my faith as a Christian to advocating for those who are less fortunate, for children, for those who don't have or who have lacked political power. And I think as people of faith, not only are we to preserve and protect our environment, but make sure that everyone has access to clean air, clean water, et cetera. And that those principles are grounded in a lot of how I approach the environmental justice work and how others do as well. Next slide. Just one example of another very impactful moment was with Warren County in 1982. In the fall of 1982, Warren County was one of the poorest counties in North Carolina, and it drew national attention with civil rights figures, religious leaders, and others who joined local residents to stop construction of a toxic waste landfill. Protesters blocked trucks at the dump site, and hundreds were arrested during 6 weeks of demonstration. And this marked the first time that Americans had been arrested for protesting at a landfill. And the issue of this rural, mostly African-American community began 4 years earlier in the summer of 1978 when trucks were hired by a Raleigh, North Carolina transfer company illegally, and they were drizzling PCB-laden oil along North Carolina roads rather than pay the cost of disposing the oil. And so more than 30,000 gallons were dumped along some 240 miles of roadway in 14 counties. And so this and so many other instances articulate that in many cases, Black and brown people and poor people have, in many instances, unfortunately, become their communities that are seen as sacrifice zones for corporations and sometimes government entities who don't want to encourage and include them in the decision-making process. And that's an environmental injustice that a lot of us are working still to this day to make sure that those communities who are most impacted have a say in what's going on in their neighborhoods and can also articulate the ways to rectify those problems and create solutions. Next slide. The United Church of Christ's Commission on Racial Justice in 1987, as a series of events led to conducting a study on hazardous waste sites in the United States. In communities with 2 or more facilities or one of the nation's 5 largest landfills, the average minority percentage of the population was more than 3 times that of communities without facilities. So although socioeconomic status appeared to play an important role in the location of commercial hazardous waste facilities, race still proved to be more significant. Next slide. And even to this day, race is still the most significant predictor of a person living near contaminated air, water, and soil. And these are just some quick percentages and data that articulate this and how that impacts communities. So 56% of the population at toxic waste sites are people of color. 38% of these folks have higher exposure to nitrogen dioxide. These communities are 2 times more likely to live without potable water and modern sanitation. And so, again, people of color have direct exposure to a number of toxic chemicals, plants, et cetera, that exacerbate health conditions like asthma, respiratory problems, et cetera, even leading to premature death. Next slide. And just quickly, we try to ground our work in principles, and so there are principles of environmental justice. There are 17 of these that were adopted in 1991 at the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit. And some of them are affirming the sacredness of Mother Earth, demanding that the public policies be based on mutual respect and justice for all peoples free from any form of discrimination or bias, affirms the right of all workers to a safe and healthy work environment without being forced to choose between an unsafe livelihood and unemployment. And again, there's 17 of these, and we definitely recommend that you look into them so that you can understand the principles that ground our work. Next slide. We also try to implement the Jemez principles of democratic organizing into environmental justice work with other groups and stakeholders. And just some of those principles include being inclusive, emphasizing bottom-up organizing, letting people speak for themselves, working together in solidarity and mutuality, building just relationships amongst ourselves, and commitment to self-transformation. And at the crust of that is making sure that in many cases, more fluent groups or organizations may come into a community with an idea of what that community needs and will, have all the greatest intentions, but will not take the time and effort to discuss with that community what their real problems are and what their solutions are and how they feel that their lives should change if, we look to address their problems, and that is very problematic. So we encourage our stakeholders, our partners to become aware and to follow the Jemez principles for democratic organizing. Next slide. So as I mentioned, just yesterday was World Environmental Health Day. So this webcast is pretty timely. And one of their focuses this year was air pollution, as it is the heart of social justice and global inequalities. And so, and I'll be kind of reiterating this throughout, but our most vulnerable communities are most at risk when we have high amounts of air pollution, and that's women and children, the elderly, and low-income populations. Next slide. And so, you know, we're talking about this issue a lot. Climate change, is it real? You know, and if it is real, how does it impact us individually? How does it impact communities? Well, according to this slide, but of course, according to scientists, climate change is definitely real. It's real and it's man-made, and there's overwhelming scientific consensus that it's true. Human-produced pollution is causing climate change that is dangerous now and will become much more dangerous in the future if we do not act. Next slide. And this is just an image just kind of depicting how greenhouse gases impact our atmosphere in terms of trapping some heat, some of the sun's heat and keeping our planet warm, et cetera. And one of the biggest contributors to these greenhouse gases is our use and dependence on burning fossil fuels. And I think, you know, as we think about solutions to addressing climate change, lessening our dependence on fossil fuels is imperative. And so that's looking at, you know, solar and wind as alternatives to generating the electricity and the energy that we use. Next slide. So how are we experiencing climate change? Climate change is already occurring, and the most recent science suggests that the global temperature is likely to rise 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels between 2030 and 2052. Should warming exceed 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels before the year 2100, the impacts of climate change will be extensive and devastating. With increasingly frequent and intense weather catastrophes, sea level rise, and biodiversity loss, our society will be fundamentally changed, and not necessarily for the better. Understanding the impact of climate change cannot be done without considering historic disadvantage and current poverty, as the biggest losers for climate change are those who are already vulnerable. If we do not address our current societal inequities, people of color and low-income communities will remain the first to experience the worst impact of our climate disasters, and climate change will only encourage greater disparities between the haves and the have-nots. And so the image here just articulates that we've pretty much been having hotter days, hotter years, 2018 being one of the hottest years on record. We're seeing extreme heat, droughts, rain and flooding, oceans, cold ice storms, etc. And all of these, the causal connection is the growing crisis of climate change. Next slide. One thing that we are seeing a lot of are just incredibly crazy extreme weather conditions. And the top 10 most expensive natural disasters since 1990, of the top 5, 3 of them happened just in 2017. And so the most expensive natural disaster that we've had since 1980 was Hurricane Katrina, where it had $163.8 billion in damages. But just in 2017, we had 3 instances of incredibly disastrous hurricanes. Hurricane Harvey, where we saw $126.3 billion in damage. Hurricane Maria, where we saw $90.9 billion in damage. And Hurricane Irma, where we saw $50.5 billion in damage. And so to have 3 of those in 1 year, I'm sure we all remember just looking at what was happening in Houston and in the Gulf South and in the Caribbean and in Puerto Rico, et cetera. And again, in those places where people of color are predominantly based, the lack of support that we've seen in comparison to, say, Texas versus Puerto Rico shows that people of color have not always received the same treatment, even from our own federal government. Next slide. And so these are just images of the various ways that we're experiencing climate change. The one image here is from Katrina, another from Puerto Rico, another is an image of the devastating fires, forest fires that happened in California. Next slide. And in addition to these extreme, hello? Oh, in addition to these really extreme weather instances is the issue of displacement. When hurricanes happen, in many cases, communities are encouraged to evacuate, and so there's always a question of, what happens to that community? Are they able to return? Are they able to continue their lives after conditions have improved? And in one instance, with the folks in New Orleans who were impacted by Katrina, we're seeing that a lot of people have still been displaced by Katrina. Hurricane Katrina made landfall in the city of New Orleans on the morning of August 29th, 2015, swept in by winds traveling at 127 miles per hour. But the true damage came after the levees broke, when about 80% of the city flooded. At least 400,000 residents, nearly the entire city, were displaced, some for a few days, some forever. 12 years later, there is still no single comprehensive source of information on what happened to displaced New Orleans residents, or where they went, or why. Beyond FEMA and U.S. Census data collected a year or less after the disaster, neither the local nor federal government had systems in place to systematically track Katrina's castaways. A lot of people who were impacted by Katrina ended up moving to Houston and other places, and in many cases because of economic issues, a lot of the people were low income who left, and they've just never been able to return. And what we're also seeing too in places like New Orleans that have been impacted by these types of extreme weather conditions is gentrification is now sitting in, where more affluent people are now moving into New Orleans, and the cost of living in many areas has gone up quite exponentially because of gentrification and those drivers of rents and mortgages going up, because honestly the demand by non-Black people have increased for property in those areas. So again, these people who were displaced because of Hurricane Katrina, who couldn't even afford to come back, likely if they could afford to come back, are now having to deal with the negative impacts of gentrification in their communities. Next slide. And then, beyond the last 10 years, happening right now in 8 states, we're seeing massive flooding along the portion of the Mississippi River due to relentless, record-breaking spring rainfall. And it's the longest lasting since the Great Floods of 1927. All of this year's flooding is due to both early spring snowmelt and seemingly endless rain. Since the start of 2019, much of the lower Ohio and lower Mississippi River valleys have picked up more than 2 feet of rain. A few spots have even received over 40 inches of rain. And so again, this is happening right now. And these are areas in Missouri, in Arkansas, et cetera, that are experiencing incredible amounts of flooding. And this map just kind of articulates where major flooding is happening, moderate flooding, minor, et cetera. But it speaks to how there's just a continual increase of extreme weather conditions that are hitting people incredibly hard, back to back in many cases. Next slide. As it relates to things internationally, there's also going to be a major, and already we're seeing major impacts on various Black and brown countries throughout the world. By 2050, if no action is taken, there will be more than 143 million internal climate migrants across 3 regions, and that's Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, Latin America, et cetera. And these are going to be, these climate conditions will be forcing whole communities to seek more viable land and less vulnerable places to live. The impacts of extreme national disasters is equivalent to a global loss of $520 billion annually in consumption, forcing close to 26 million people into poverty every single year. Climate change is already impacting human health. Air pollution leads to 7 million premature deaths every year, and the direct costs could be as high as $4 billion per year by 2030. Next slide. And so when we think about climate change, the biggest contributor in many cases are our carbon emissions. And power plants have historically been the biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States for over 40 years. But some new data is showing, and this data is from the U.S. Energy Information Administration, that transportation is now the #1 producer of carbon emissions. And so the U.S. transportation sector, which includes cars, trucks, planes, trains, boats, etc., now emits 1.9 billion tons of carbon dioxide annually. And the electric power sector emits 1.8 billion tons. And so just to be clear, the decline in power sector emissions since the mid-2000s isn't due to America's using less energy. It's just that we have begun to incorporate newer types of energy sources. We're using less carbon-intensive sources, such as switching from coal to natural gas, which is still incredibly problematic and still has pollutants and co-pollutants that directly impact our air quality in the communities that live adjacent. But we're also looking at more renewable options like wind and solar power. Next slide. And so this is just some more data to show how just massive the transportation sector is, and in terms of the share of greenhouse gas emissions. And this one graph is from 2016. This other graph shows the number of vehicle registrations in the United States from 1990 to 2017. So there's just been this massive growth of cars. And the more cars that we have on the road, the more oil that we're using, the more that these vehicles are emitting, it's increasing the pollution and leading to poor air quality. And what we've seen, especially as a result of systemic housing trends that have segregated and placed people of color and low-income communities in areas that are less desirable, that tend to also either be already near or led, or some cities and states have started, would start putting highways, et cetera, closer to these communities. We're seeing that communities of color have higher rates of asthma, have higher rates of respiratory problems, et cetera. And so again, as we have more vehicles on the road, those communities and their health conditions are further exacerbated because of these poor air quality trends that are happening. Next slide. Thank you. Yep, stay here. And so just to reiterate, there's some recent research that shows that this trend not only happens in America, but it is happening internationally. Global pediatric asthma prevalence has increased strikingly since the 1950s, and asthma is now the most commonly reported non-communicable disease among children worldwide. Over the past decade, several studies have shown, several studies done in North America, Latin America, Europe, and East Asia have reported associations with between traffic-related air pollution, exposure, and onset asthma in children. And one of the markers that they've been using to determine this is the amount of nitrogen dioxide that's in the air. And this graph kind of just articulates population, rates of asthma, and nitrogen dioxide. And if you see the darker colors tend to show the correlation between the levels of nitrogen dioxide in the air and then the increase of asthma rates for children in these countries, in addition to America and other developing countries. And so what we're seeing again is that our most vulnerable, our children, et cetera, are impacted because of just our desire to have more vehicles, and also our strong, unfortunate dependence on fossil fuels and those fuels burning and polluting the air. Next slide. So the time is now. And it kind of has always been now, but even more so, we're seeing a lot more reports come out that are speaking to the dire situation that is going to require everybody, and especially our more developed countries, particularly the United States, becoming and returning to its place as a leader as it relates to not only addressing climate change, but also addressing just our dependence on fossil fuels. Scientists have been warning us for decades that humans are causing severe and potentially irreversible changes to the climate, essentially baking our planet and ourselves with carbon dioxide. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released a report just this last October that put a lot of people into a panic, but I think necessarily so. And it warned that we were roughly 12 and now 11 years away from doing what would be required to make a massive changes that could stop the worst impacts of climate change. And a lot of that concern has driven and has played a role in impacting more activism at the state, at the city, at the local, at the national and international level, where we're seeing a lot of young people and more progressive folks now step forward to think about running for office, et cetera, to become more leaders on this, because not only are they concerned about the future of our world, but just ensuring that our most vulnerable, our children, our elderly, and people of color, low-income communities have get the necessary protection to restore their quality of life. Next slide. And just from my perspective, the work that I do in Washington, D.C. is policy related. As I said earlier, I work here doing federal policy and advocating for environmental justice issues. And as a result of the last election cycle, we've seen a massive increase in progressive ideas in terms of how are we going to address climate change, how are we going to also do so with a focus on communities of color who have for decades and for generations been at the brunt of a lot of industrial revolutions that have happened, or not benefiting from the economic growth and that we've seen in other communities. And so one step in that direction, we feel the Green New Deal is one of the most comprehensive plans to address climate change that the federal government has ever entertained. And to be clear, the Green New Deal is an idea. It is not legislation. It is a resolution, and it supports not only achieving net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, but it also seeks to radically restructure the economy to work for disadvantaged and oppressed communities. We endorse this resolution, and we look forward to working with our allies here in Washington, D.C. and nationally to improve the current language around environmental justice communities in order to ensure that the resolution will have maximum effect in supporting our communities. Now, we know that, again, the Green New Deal is just a resolution, so it's non-binding. And what happens from policy perspective, from a legislative perspective, is that we must start drafting bills that reflect this dynamic idea. And so not only must we draft legislation and implement policy to protect not just the rich, but we must do so for everyone. We must act now to protect communities like those in Houston who have been underneath black plumes and fire in the air as they were being poisoned by toxic chemicals. We also must act now for the people of Flint, Michigan, who have still not had clean drinking water in well over 2,000 days, and the countless cities in our countries without clean water due to a failure to update our old infrastructure. We must act now, to provide a just transition for our brothers and sisters in Appalachian communities who've been sacrificing their bodies to not only power our countries, but to, support their own families. And so we act specifically, and with a number of members of the environmental justice movement, we look forward to working with everyone to draft and pass legislation that has a clear timeline about ending our dependence on fossil fuels, because we know that that is the biggest driver of climate change, but also to address fossil fuels that are disproportionately polluting the air, water, and soil where frontline and vulnerable Indigenous peoples live, work, and play. In addition, we're really excited, and we hope to encourage members to avoid technological ideas like carbon sequestration methods that have been unproven at the scale of the problem that we know climate change to be. Next slide. And one thing we're incredibly proud of as a long-standing community-driven environmental justice organization is that we have looked to our membership base, and we have a membership base of over 800 people. And after Hurricane Sandy, we sat down with a large number of folks in our community to ask, how should we resolve and respond to climate crisis? We know that there will be more hurricanes. We know that there will be more extreme situations happening, not only where we're based in New York, but all throughout the country. And so what we did over the course of the past 6 years, we've been having a number of community planning meetings. We've been having really in-depth conversations with stakeholders, and we are looking at ways to devise policies and plans that really incorporate the needs of our communities. And one thing that we're incredibly proud of is our Solar Uptown Now program. And so as folks are thinking about what a Green New Deal should look like, I'm excited that environmental justice organizations that are based and rooted in their communities like We Act are already showing clear examples of ways to not only address climate change, environmental pollution, but also find ways to train and employ the people who live in their communities to become a part of the clean and renewable energy sector, to not only create jobs, but to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels, and also reduce the economic burdens that a number of people of color especially are facing as it relates to their electric bills and their utility bills. And so our Solar Uptown Now program is serving 900 residents in Harlem, and we've been able already in the first year, they're going to see impacts of, it puts 270 kilowatts of renewable energy on the roofs of affordable housing buildings in our communities, and it contributes to employment, lower energy bills, and reduces greenhouse gas emissions. And so this program, Solar Uptown Now, demonstrates what a Green New Deal or any type of community-driven green job creation opportunity could look like and can be duplicated throughout the country. And it's a way to provide a just transition to renewable energy that combats climate change, reduces pollution, lowers energy costs, and supports a Green New Deal. Next slide. And this is just some more images of one of our first installations, and the gentleman that's standing in front of the solar panels is one of the many folks. We've trained, I believe, 90 individuals in the Harlem community about how to install solar and create job opportunities for them. Next slide. So this was a long discussion. It was really hard for me to choose. There's so many issues that communities of color are experiencing right now as it relates to climate change, and I think it's imperative that we continue this dialogue. I'm really appreciative of the opportunity to return back to this community, Pax Christi, to talk about issues, and I look forward to any questions that people might have about climate change, about environmental justice, how your church, your community can become more involved in this. And if there are any questions, we have additional time to do some questions and answers right now. Any questions?
I don't see any questions popping up so far. Oh, okay, so Mark Hackler, he asked, do you provide organizer training remotely?
We are really concerned and devoted to being rooted in our communities. And so the trainings that we provide tend to be specifically in Harlem, but we also convene the Environmental Justice Leadership Forum on Climate Change, which is a coalition of 45 organizations throughout the country. And if you aren't in Harlem, where, you know, we are always encouraging folks to become members of the We Act membership group, you know, please reach out to me and I'll be happy to connect you with an environmental justice organization that is based in your area. Like I don't know, we tend to do all of our trainings in person in our Harlem office. But we also are doing a webinar series where we're continuing these kinds of discussions on various issues that folks are experiencing, and policy and other types of tools that communities of color and low-income groups can use to advocate for themselves. So if you are interested in learning more, please feel free to email me and I'll put you on the mailing list.
Awesome. And Barbara Beasley, she asks, how can you best involve youth? What message works?
I think the exciting thing is young people, like my brother, my interns, etc., they're totally aware of what's going on with their environment and they want to become involved. And I think the most exciting thing to do is to ask them what they would want to do and how they want to solve the problem. I think the beauty of being a little bit older than teenagers, you know, I'm in my 30s, is we have the wisdom and experience, but then they have the energy and the excitement. So I would really empower young people to kind of articulate what they think a solution might be, and then connect them with folks who have had past experiences in that area to see how they can marry their excitement with the experience and energy of those who came before. I would say, you know, there's little things that we can do. Like there's a lot of talk right now about our plastic use and how, you know, even when we think we're recycling, a number of the items that we throw away may not be recycled depending on the, how it's discarded. And I'm really concerned about this because what we're seeing is communities of color that might be in close proximity to incinerators and landfills are then impacted by that pollution. So I would encourage, you know, if you're working with young people, to think about revolutionary ways to, you know, lessen our plastic use, even, you know, if it's looking at items that are not plastic-based or styrofoam, et cetera. And even with like the plastic straw thing that's happening, where a lot of cities are transferring over to things that are easier to compost, like just being more creative with encouraging folks to do that work. I would think too, right now, if you have young people who are, you know, going away to college or looking for opportunities, there's so many job opportunities in the renewable energy sector right now, like wind turbine technicians and solar PV installers, et cetera. There's such a high demand. And if there's a way to marry a young person's entrepreneurial skills and interest with getting them involved in the renewable energy sector, that's another way, I think, to show them the economic benefits of it, and as well as how solar and wind can help us get off of fossil fuels.
Does anyone else have any other questions? Okay, it doesn't look like we have any others coming in. So again, just on behalf of Parks Trustee USA, I really want to thank you, Kerene, for being with us today and sharing all your vast knowledge and ways to be involved and so forth. It's really great. And I hope to see you again.
Yeah, no, thanks. I really appreciate it. And like I said, there's so much to talk about, but I hope I shared something of value to your crew that's listening. And I think people of faith particularly have a moral role in justifying and making the connection between the benefits and the beauty of the earth and the environment that, you know, God has given us, and ensuring that, you know, we can pass on a healthy earth, you know, clean air, clean water, soil, the places where our children play and go to school, pass on a world that they can then, you know, not only just survive in, but thrive in, and also, you know, live healthy lives. So if anything I share today can inspire you to think about how you can critically make a change at your local and state and even federal level, you know, I'm glad to have done that today.
Thank you. And I hope everyone has a lovely day, and we'll have, you can go to weact.org for more information, or paxchristiusa.org. We're going to have this webinar recorded and sent out to you if you want to watch it again or share it with your family, friends, Pax Christi USA groups, local community groups. So everyone have a lovely day. Take care.
Bye.